Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing the clubs for December 2025. First, we have the wax seal of the month called Heartburst, and we have some Christmas mix wax beads there. Then we have the stencil of the month called Where Love Lands. The clear stamp of the month, which also has coordinating dies, is called Simply Said, and I love that there's just so many different sentiments in that set. We have an embossing folder of the month called Sweet Stems, as well as a 3D embossing folder called Unlock My Heart, perfect for Valentine's Day or even like wedding, bridal, that sort of thing would be fun too. Then our better press of the month is called I'd Pick You. The glimmer of the month is called Soft Hearted, perfect for those backgrounds. And we have some bright pink glimmer foil to use with that. The stitching die of the month is called A Perfect Blend. So it has two different coffee mugs. There's a little thing to make it into tea with a couple sentiments as well with it. Then we have the die of the month called Better Together, with the option of doing a couple owls or even doing an otter, which is absolutely adorable. And I'm going to be doing both. Our large die of the month is called Wrapped in Care. This is just a perfect one for like self-care cards, and the clear stamp of the month sentiments pair perfectly with that as well. The caboodle is called Unwind, and that also coordinates with the large die of the month. This DIY deck color card is my color palette inspiration. I'm also going to add a few extra colors in there where it works. I'm going to start off by creating some wax seals with the wax seal of the month so that I have them ready to go for when I'm card making. So I have the wax starter kit here. I also have some silicone spoons. It's really more the spatula. I like to use it to scrape the excess wax out of that little hot scoop there, making sure that I get as much as possible. And the great thing with that silicone tool is that wax just peels right off of there once it's cooled. I also have my wax storage kit with my handle in it, and I love the fact that it's adjustable and perfect for storing the handles as well as the wax stamps. From that Christmas mix, I'm going to use the pearl and the gold color, but I'm also bringing in some pinks from the pink mix because it's going to go well with the color palette that I've chosen. So I swirl the pearl and the gold together, pour them on my silicone mat here, let those cool while the pink ones are warming up and melting. I have a little toothpick here that I use to stir it while it is melting, just to swirl everything around and make sure those wax beads are actually completely melted before I pour them out onto my mat. When it comes time to using the rest of it up, that's where that silicone spatula comes in handy. I don't have enough here for a full wax seal, but I am just using up that excess. That wax could be remelted if it doesn't, or if I'm not going to use it, and that one I'd end up not using, so I can remelt it to create a complete one. I'm using some of the silver bouillon powder. This came out last month. It's a great way to add luster and shine to those wax seals. Works really, really well on darker color wax seals, so you can see that silver, but even on lighter ones, it just adds that beautiful shine to it. And I just love the effect that it has. This comes in silver as well as gold. I just have the silver here. The other thing I'm going to prep in order to have them ready for my cards is my foiled elements. So I'm going to foil the glimmer of the month as well as the better press of the month. The better press of the month obviously can be used in both the glimmer system as well as the better press system. I actually don't end up using it in the better press system for these particular cards. I just really liked that foiled heart, and I end up just using those, and I don't even realize it until the end or once I finish creating cards that I actually didn't use it in my better press system. Typically I'll use it both ways because I love the fact that it's so versatile that you can. But in this video, I only use it for foiling. So I have my glimmer system here. It is nice and hot. I put my plates on there, put the foil with the pretty side facing that plate. The first background I did there with the glimmer of the month was with Hammermill cardstock. The second background here is with Spellbinders Cosmic Sky cardstock. So you can use the color wheel cardstock with your glimmer system. It foils beautifully. If by chance you get a little bit of overfoiling, which I typically do with some of the sentiments, I'll show you once we're done how to fix that and how to clean that up. So I'm going to do a few different backgrounds with that glimmer of the month. I also brought in some matte gold foil. So we're going to have some backgrounds with that beautiful bright pink foil and some with that gold foil. I thought it was a nice difference between the pink, as well as the fact that because I have some gold in my wax seal, I thought it would be nice to have some gold elements in some of the cards that I'm creating here. Once I'm done with my Glimmer of the Month, I put on that Better Press of the month heart. I'm going to do the heart as a background for a couple of my cards. I'm also going to do sentiments in just a moment. So when you're doing the foiling, the pretty side of the foil goes against that plate, and then you put your cardstock on top as well as the plates. Press that timer button, and once that timer button stops flashing, you can pull it out of the Glimmer system and put it through your die cutting machine. Spellbinders has a page with a list of different compatible machines. You'd need both the heat from the Glimmer system as well as the pressure from a die cutting machine in order to do that foiling, but it's really so easy. Now, when I do foiling, I also like to do my solid hot foiling, use up the excess of that foil that doesn't go onto the cardstock when you do the first bits of foiling. So once I'm done all of my sentiments here, I will bring out my solid hot foil plate and I will solid hot foil those pieces. Some of those pieces I'm going to use them as is for my cards. Some of them I'm going to use as mats around different pieces. And then other pieces, I will save them for future projects. Sometimes I use them as specialty cardstock, especially the solid hot foiled sentiments. This set of sentiments here from the Glimmer of the Month, you can see I got some overfoiling there. So that's what I'm going to show you how to correct or how to clean up once we're done. I typically don't have issues when it is a plate like the Better Press of the Month here that has a bunch of sentiments on the plate at once. Those ones I tend to get fairly clean, but when they're plates that have individual sentiments, I often get overfoiling from them. So it's always nice to know exactly how to clean them up. And even that Better Press of the Month, there is no overfoiling on it, but it still can be cleaned up a little bit. So the technique for cleaning it up is really, really easy. Once I have those sentiments done, I have my solid hot foil plate on my Glimmer system. The method for foiling with the solid hot foil plate is exactly the same as if it were a regular plate. You put the pretty side of the foil, and in this case, I'm using the excess foil, the remainder foil from my backgrounds as well as my sentiments. Put it pretty side down on that solid hot foil plate. The plates go on top of it. Press that timer button. And once that timer button has stopped flashing, then you put it through your die cutting machine for that pressure. So it's really easy to use. Even if I don't plan on using my solid hot foiled pieces in the project that I'm currently working on, I always do the solid hot foiling because it's much easier to store that cardstock with the foil already on it than the flimsy sheets of foil. As well as the fact that those flimsy sheets of foil, if you try to store them, sometimes they can get a little bit damaged. So this is just much better, and my machine is already hot anyways, so I might as well do it all at the same time. So I just sped up that solid hot foiling because it's the same repetitive process. Here are my sentiments. When it comes to cleaning them up, first thing I do is take a piece of Best Ever Craft Tape, and I use the thickest one for this. I put it on my shirt or my pants a couple times to take some of the excess sticky out of it, and then I just put it right on top of that sentiment and peel it off, and that will peel off the excess of the foil. So as I said before, this Better Press of the Month, there's no overfoiling in it. Sometimes you get overfoiling like A's and E's, the inside of letters, and there is none here, but even using that tape on it just seems to clean it up and crisp up those letters just a tiny little bit. When it comes to the Glimmer of the Month sentiments, I'm using that same tape, and I'll use it until it's basically covered with the excess foil on the back. Then I'll swap it out for a new piece of tape. Once I feel that that tape really isn't pulling anything up, then I'm going to grab a sand eraser, and this one is from Tombow, and I'm going to start cleaning up the outside parts of the letters. You can go over the letters just a little bit with a really light hand. You don't want to have a heavy hand with it because that will finish or change the finish of the foil. By doing it with a light hand, we're just going over the surface of the outside part of the cardstock. When you put the Glimmer plates through the die cutting machine, it presses those right into the cardstock, so they're a little bit recessed, and I find that you can have a little bit of leeway with it going over top with a really light hand. That'll clean up the outside parts of it and won't change the finish of the foil, but you definitely don't want to do that with a heavy hand. You don't want to press down, you want to just do it lightly. Now, white cardstock is the most unforgiving when it comes to cleaning up sentiments. So that top one there, it looks okay on camera, but in real life, there's still some marks on it. And the way that I hide that is if I want to use it on my card, I will often ink blend the background And that will take the focus away from some of those imperfections because it will color that cardstock. It'll change it a little bit and you'll still see the sentiment, but you won't see any of those imperfections quite as much. When it comes to cutting out my sentiments, I like to use the thinner size of Best Ever Craft tape to tape those dies in place. That way those dies are not going to move on me while I'm putting them through my die cutting machine. Keeps them nice and clean, and I can make sure that nothing moves and shifts because it's taped in place. And those pieces of Best Ever Craft tape can be used multiple times. I just keep using them until they don't really stick too well anymore, and then I will retire them. So you get a lot of use out of a roll of tape. Now that I have all of my foiled sentiments ready to go, I like to have all of these elements ready to go so when it comes to card making, I can just create and put things together. I don't have to stop and create sentiments or stop and foil. So to me, doing all of this prep work ahead of time, it makes the rest of the process a lot more streamlined. I'm going to take the clear stamp of the month and I'm going to stamp out a bunch of sentiments. The very first thing I do with a brand new clear stamp is I use a white eraser on it to remove any possible manufacturing residue from that stamping surface. This step only needs to be done one time. Once you've done it to a set, you don't have to do it again. I'm using another piece of hammer mill cardstock here, and I'm just going to put as many sentiments on it as I possibly can. I'm kind of keeping them in the order that they are on the sheet from the stamp set so that when it comes time to putting them back, it's going to be much easier to do. I end up getting all but one of the sentiments on this piece of cardstock. When I do this, I try to make sure there's enough space around it so that I am not going to have an issue when it comes time to die cutting those sentiments. I'm going to heat emboss these sentiments with some gold embossing powder. I typically like heat embossing sentiments rather than just stamping them with ink because it adds that raised glossy surface. It adds a little bit of extra texture. But if you prefer, you can definitely just stamp those sentiments and use a colored ink or whatever ink you want. I used an embossing powder tool on my cardstock before stamping those sentiments with some Versamark ink, and then I poured on some super fine embossing powder on it. This time it happens to be gold to coordinate with the other gold accents with the rest of my elements for my cards. You could use whatever color you want here, but again, I like that embossed look to it because it adds that extra bit of texture, and because I'm using gold embossing powder, it adds a little metallic touch to it as well. Then I use my heat tool to melt all of that powder in place. Embossing is always has a wow factor to see the embossing powder go from that matte granular to that glossy finish. And I think it always really elevates and finishes off a card. Now I have all of my dies here. I'm going to match them one by one, taping them in place with that Best Ever Craft tape. And yes, I'm using the same tape that I used for my foiled sentiments there. Recycling that tape, giving it a second use. Anytime you're using dies with your stamped images, you just want to make sure that you don't have any dies that are overlapping each other. That is going to ruin the die. So I do it or run it through twice to get all of those sentiments die cut out, and then set them aside to pick and choose as I'm creating. So now that I have all of those pieces ready to go, I'm ready to start creating my cards. So for my first one, I'm going to use the Better Press of the Month foiled background. I'm using both the foiled as well as the solid hot foiled piece. I'm going to use that solid hot foiled piece as my mat. So that's going to coordinate perfectly with that foiled heart in the middle. So my solid hot foiled piece was trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And then my foiled piece there is trimmed to 3 1/2 inches by 4 3/4 inches so that I have a nice even mat around it. To add just a little bit of extra color, I'm using some Twisted Citron Distress ink and just lightly blending around the outside of the ink. Now I'm also going to ink blend my foiled sentiment so that pops right off the heart as well. So I use a large Spellbinders blending brush. I love these for doing backgrounds because you can get a really light color as well as you can really deepen the color on them. So I'm using that same brush for both the inking around the outside of my heart and for my sentiment. Once I have those done, I take them off of my sticky mat and I'm ready to start assembling my cards. Now I'm using some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle. I love using this glue and I use it for probably about 95% of my projects. It works really well. It starts to grab fairly quickly, and by using that fine line bottle, I can use it for tiny die cuts or assembling the card like I am, or my cards like I am right here. Once I have my piece with my heart as well as that mat, I can add my sentiment. And I'm going to use that same glue for my wax seal as well. I do have wax seal adhesive stickers, but I often will use that glue. It works. It just takes a little bit longer to wait for that to completely dry. But I love the look of that foiled seal or the foiled heart behind it with the metallic of that wax seal. I think it's really, really pretty. And the Twisted Citron ink gives it just such a fun pop of color. For my next card, I'm going to be using the Stencil of the Month on some Hammermill cardstock. I do love Hammermill cardstock for doing my ink blending on, as well as my stenciling. I have a sticky mat here holding my piece in place so that it doesn't move on me, and it is holding that stencil, but I always have my fingers on it just to make sure it doesn't move on me. For the first part of that stencil, I use some sponge sugar, and I am ink blending with my larger blending brushes, those Spellbinders blending brushes, because they are just perfect for blending, and I can make sure whether I have it light or dark when I'm putting that ink down, and I like having that control. I also added just a little bit of antique linen for the belly of the bird. Then I went and layered on the second layer. I'm using some Kitsch Flamingo for those flowers as well as for the top part of the heart. Then I add a little bit of picked raspberry for some of those areas to make them just a little bit deeper. I always love having lighter areas and darker areas. I think it just adds more visual dimension. So I will regularly do that for my backgrounds as well as my stenciling. I just think it looks more interesting to have darker areas and lighter areas. Now for the top part of that wing, I used a little bit of brushed corduroy. Then I layer on my next layer, and I'm using a little bit of that brushed corduroy again, but I just use whatever is left on that brush from doing it from my last layer. Then the picked raspberry for the end of the bird's tail, and again, I just left whatever was on my brush and just use that. That way I don't have too much color. I can always re-ink my brush if I find that I don't have enough, but always best to be on this, or to err on the side of the caution, go lighter, because you can always add a little bit more ink if you need. You just can't take away once it gets a little bit too dark. For the greenery, I start with that Twisted Citron that I used for ink blending the background of my last card, and then add just a little bit of mowed lawn for some of the darker areas, some of the shadow within those leaves, as well as using that for the stems and stuff like that. Now, part of the fun of layering stencil is building up those layers and adding them to create a full picture, but I also love using different inks to add some visual texture and dimension. Here I just use regular distress inks for all of the layers, but you could also use metallic inks or interference inks for a little bit of extra shimmer. I have something else planned for this though, so I didn't want to go in and have too many textures to it. I wanted to keep the image fairly simple, but then I also want to add just a touch of sparkle. One of the ways I love adding sparkle is with Moondust Stickles glitter gel. So I realigned one of my layer stencils, wiped off the ink that was on there with a dry microfiber cloth. That way, when I go to use the Moondust Stickles glitter gel, I'm not rehydrating that ink and coloring that gel. We're going to see the color of the ink that's underneath it. So I use a palette knife to completely fill in the heart that bird is holding. And then I want to add just a tiny little bit to the bottom parts of the petals as well as the tip of the bird's wing. So I use my finger for that. I just dip it in the Moondust Stickles glitter gel, start from the bottom of the stencil where I want it to be heaviest, and just use my finger to kind of paint it on. I want it to kind of fade into nothing. If I were to use the palette knife, I would have to fill in the entire thing and I wouldn't have as much control. By using my finger, I have control over how much of the Stickles glitter gel I get in there, and I really love the result. This is the first time I've done it this way, and I've had this idea for a while and I wasn't sure how it was going to turn out, but worst case scenario, we have to do the image over again. Best case scenario, it turns out exactly how you wanted, and I was so happy with the result. I waited probably about an hour for all of that to dry. I wanted to make sure it was 100% dry before carrying on with my next step. So I cut my piece down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And then I'm using some tumbled glass distress ink as well as a little bit of chipped sapphire to ink blend the sky. Originally, I wasn't going to do anything to the background, but it just felt like it needed a little bit in the sky. It was a little bit too stark without it. When I did this ink blending, I avoided those images so that I didn't get the blue ink over top of it. It was mostly just around the edges, but it's enough to add a background to that image to finish it off. Then I took a piece of Wildberry cardstock and cut it down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches to use as my mat. That coordinates beautifully with the picked raspberry. It's a little bit darker than the picked raspberry, but it coordinates enough that it frames it really, really nicely. Another option here would be either a brown or a green to frame it, but I really like how that pink outside really brings out all of the pinks in the image. I chose one of my foiled sentiments, and this was the sentiment that had a little bit of overfoiling. And when I went to remove all of that overfoiling, there's just some marks on the white cardstock, so it wasn't perfect. But by using some of that tumbled glass distress ink and ink blending around it, you can't see any of those marks. It hides them beautifully. And it makes it so that you can reuse some of those sentiments that aren't absolutely perfect. Now you could take one of the wax seals here and add it for a little bit of extra texture, but I opted to save it for a future card. Future in this video. So I don't add it there, but I just wanted to show that that was an option. For my next card, I'm using the 3D embossing folder of the month with some Wildberry cardstock, and I taped it into that embossing folder with some Best Ever craft tape and inked the opposite side of the folder with some of that Chip Sapphire Distress ink. Now, I love doing this technique and I do it fairly often. It just makes those 3D images or the embossing really pop, and it's just a fun way to change up your embossed backgrounds. I'm using Chip Sapphire here, and Distress ink is transparent, so what we're actually going to see in the background is more of a purple tone. That pink is going to shine through some of that Chip Sapphire. If you want it to be completely dark, you could use a black ink, and that would be a little bit more contrast with the pink cardstock, but I really love the look of the Chip Sapphire. And I was trying not to bring in 1,000 different distress ink colors, so I opted to go with one that I'd already used on a card and see how that turned out, and it looks really, really cool. So you can use this background or ink this background as many times as you want till you have the coverage that you want. Typically for me, most of the time, it's usually around 3 or 4 times. Here, I believe I do it about 5 times. But again, you just keep repeating that process until you have the coverage you want. Because I use that Best Ever craft tape to tape that cardstock in there, I don't have to worry about that cardstock moving. It's not going to move on me. All I have to worry about is getting my ink on my background and the coverage that I'm getting. So I just re-ink the background, close it, put it through my die cutting machine as many times as I want until I get the result that I want. Once I have that done, I trim that piece down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Then I take another piece of hammer mill cardstock and I trim that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I want to highlight the embossed texture on my background, and I want to do it with a gold metallic to tie in with some of the gold accents that I have on the rest of the cards. So I'm using my Lisa Horton gold ink pad. I use this so often. I absolutely love this pad. This one and the silver one, I really don't have a favorite, which is funny because typically I prefer silver over gold, but I think I tend to use the gold a little bit more. So I use that gold pad around the outside of that hammer mill cardstock to basically create some faux metallic cardstock. This is a great alternative if you run out of some of your specialty cardstocks. It's a lot more economical, and it's a great way to have a second use for that metallic pad. I also do this often with my interference pads or my color shift pads. It's a great way to use up those ink pads and have a perfectly coordinated mat for your image. Once I did it around the outside, I put that embossed piece on my sticky mat, rubbed that pad over top of it till I had as much of that gold on there as I wanted, and then assembled my card, finishing it off with that gold and pearl wax seal. For my next card, I'm going to start off with one of my glimmer foiled backgrounds and solid hot foiled backgrounds. I'm going to use the solid hot foiled piece for my mat. I'm trimming that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And then I'm trimming the foiled piece to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And typically I'll take 1/4 inch off of each side. I don't worry about the pattern matching completely, but it's going to have a nice contrast having the foiled as well as that solid hot foiled background. For this card, I plan on using the die of the month with the little otter. So I'm going to create a little bit of an ink blended background over top of that foil. I use the Twisted Citron ink first and then a little bit of Modelon on the bottom. then adding that tumbled glass on the top with a little bit of that chipped sapphire around the outside edges, just to kind of frame it in a little bit. I'm not trying to make it a really dark background, but I thought just a little bit of color with that texture from that foiled background would be a nice background for the adorable little otter. So I glue those to the base of my card, and then I can set them aside while I assemble my die cuts here. And you can see how easy it is to use that Barely Art glue with that fine line bottle on the back side of that cardstock. It gives you that little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy everything in place. So I have all of my pieces for my otter die cut here. There are a couple optional sentiments that you can insert into that little tummy of the otter. One says love like, and then the other one says no otter. So you could do like a duo of them and have sentiments right on their belly. I already had picked out what sentiment I wanted to use, and I wanted my little otter to be holding some flowers. So there was no point in adding that sentiment to it because it was going to be completely covered anyways. But I just wanted you to know that there is an option of a little cute punny sentiment to go on those little otter bellies. I thought that was a really cute additional option on there. So I cut out a bunch of different flowers from tutu cardstock, wild berry cardstock, as well as blush cardstock. My greens here are done with or die cut from rainforest cardstock. And these are all tiny little pieces, so they're a great way to use up cardstock scraps. My otter is created with a combination of alabaster cardstock for the tummy, truffle cardstock for the background, as well as fawn cardstock for his little face, as well as arms and tail. Now there's two options for a tail, so you can pick and choose which way you want it to curve, which I love that option as well. When it came time to put on these florals, I kind of start with the back of my little bouquet and then kind of work my way forward. But the great thing about using that liquid glue is if by chance I decide I want to tuck something underneath there, I still have that wiggle room to be able to do that. I probably put too many florals for him holding. I don't think an otter would actually be able to hold all of them, but I love the texture that it gives as well as the dimension. So once I have as many pieces as I want in there, I can put those rest over to the side, or the rest of them to the side. I can save them for future projects. I'm going to add that little sentiment on the bottom of the card, and the one that I chose was I'd pick you again. I thought that worked perfectly with the bouquet of flowers that he's holding. And then glue the otter on there, let that dry for a few moments. The floral dies, you can die cut the floral center with them, but I always love just using stickles in the centers of flowers. It adds that little bit of sparkle and the little bit of texture. A little bit easier than die cutting all of those circles as well. So once I have those down there, I put that aside to dry while I'm working on my next card. So for the next one here, I'm using the owls from the die of the month. I'm going to use my heart foiled background that is done with that matte gold foil on the Cosmic Sky cardstock. I think it's a perfect background for these adorable little owls. And they're die cut with a combination of alabaster, fawn, and truffle cardstock as well, just like the otters, with a little bit of black going behind the nose and beak for those accents. Now, they don't actually have bodies to them. They have those little hearts. I think they're their wings folded in. So those are die cut out of some wild berry cardstock as well as tutu cardstock. But I think it would look pretty done with those same colors as the owls if you wanted them to blend in a little bit more rather than be a little bit more prominent. I chose to keep them bright and prominent by using that wild berry and tutu cardstock because it's going to coordinate nicely with the florals that I have planned for them, as well as it just looks a little bit more Valentines-y-ish. So I'm gluing together all of these pieces. I have an acrylic block here. I use this regularly when I'm die cutting a bunch of pieces together or gluing a bunch of die cuts together. It will hold everything nice and flat while my hands are free for gluing different pieces together. There is a top part of the head that goes on the owl to the left. On the owl to the right, I used a little crown of flowers for that. I had die cut a second top of the head just because I thought maybe it might look like it needed it, but as I was creating, I didn't find that I thought it needed it, so I just added that crown of flowers. So the greenery is die cut out of that rainforest cardstock, and then I have the flowers die cut out of the tutu wild berry as well as blush cardstock. I always like having a variety of different colored shades, and again, with those larger flowers, when you're die cutting them, you can die cut the circles for the centers of them as well. I opt not to because I'm going to put some stickles on them. So I set those off to the side to dry, and we're ready to start assembling the background of the card. I trimmed down my solid hot foiled piece down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So a little more than I wanted. I was mixing up the part that I was going to do for the front and the part that I was going to do for the back. So when it comes to trimming down my piece that was done on the Cosmic Sky cardstock, I trim it down just a little bit more. So I trim that down to 3 5/8 by 4 7/8, just to make it even more confusing. When I'm trimming those down, I am looking at the heart and making sure that the center of the measurement meets the center of the heart, so that I have that heart centered on my background here. Then I can glue those both to my A2 card base, and once I have those down, we're ready to start assembling the rest of the image. Now this die set also has a branch with some larger florals, and I've already used those larger florals for that otter to be holding, but for this card I'm going to be using those florals on that little branch. I also have some of the smaller florals die cut, some extra ones, so that I can tuck those in with the larger ones just to have a little bit more variety. So first I glue my branch in front of my background heart there. Then I can glue the 2 owls above it, and then I can glue on their tails. Now I've got the tail in front of the branch, which wouldn't be actually accurate if this was real life. However, I know that I have some florals and foliage here that is going to go on top of those tail pieces. So we're never going to see that that tail was put in front of the branches. So when I'm doing these flowers, or when I'm putting the flowers on my branch, I'm making sure to not have the same color of flower right beside the same color of heart. So I'm going to have the lighter flowers right beside the darker heart, and then the darker flowers right beside the lighter heart, just so that you can see each one of those elements and we're not hiding anything by having those pieces that are the same color cardstock right next to each other. And again, because I'm using some liquid glue here, if by chance I change my mind while I'm creating, I can always tuck something behind something else, and it gives me a little bit of wiggle room. Anytime I'm creating something that has like a floral arrangement or florals and foliage, I like having that extra wiggle room to be able to move and shimmy things in place as I'm creating it. Once I have everything in place, then I just let that dry. And again, it doesn't take too long to dry. As I'm creating here, I realized that I want to have a little bit more of those florals. So I have a few extras from the crown of florals on top of the owl's head, as well as some extras from creating the otter. So I'm just using those. I grab those. Anytime I'm doing die cuts, I often like to die cut extra pieces so that I have lots to choose from while I'm creating. Sometimes I have the exact amount that I had planned or that I had figured I was going to need. Sometimes I find that there's just an area that needs something else tucked into it. And because these pieces are so tiny, they're often die cut out of cardstock scrap, so it's always easy to have just a few extras. If I happen to finish my project and still have those extras, I'll just tuck those into a little Ziploc bag, put them right back with my die set, and I will have pieces all ready for my next project. Once I have all of the florals in place that I want, I will just use those stickles to add centers to those flowers and then set those aside to completely dry. And again, it just adds that little bit of sparkle as well as that little bit of texture. And I almost forgot to add one of my sentiments here. Here I'm using one of the sentiments from the clear stamp of the month. And I love the fact that there were so many different options in that set to create so many different sentiments, and always love when there are dies that coordinate with those sentiments as well. For my next card, I'm going to be using the large die of the month. Actually, I'm going to use it for the next 2 cards. I have them die cut slightly different with a few different options, a little bit different in the color selection. So I use some of the Rainforest cardstock for the robe as well as the little towel on her head. I'm doing some light ink blending around it with the Modelon Distress ink, using that sticky mat to hold those pieces in place while I'm using my large ink blending brush to do that inking. I think this would be another area where using some interference ink would be fun because it would add that little bit of shimmer to it. But it was one of those things I didn't think about till the end. For the silhouette, the background piece, I glued the face piece on it. For this one, I'm using that silhouette piece. For the next one, I'm using it without. So you can pick and choose whether you want to have it on there or not. The silhouette piece in the background gives you an option of using just ink for the rosy cheeks if you want. I like the extra face piece on top of it because it shows you the exact placement for like the eyelashes, the cheeks, the mouth, the nose. So I chose that for both of them. But for this first one, I did that silhouette behind it because the robe is just going to go over top of the lower body. For the next one, there is a lower body piece that I chose to use because I want to use the second option with that. You'll see that in just a moment. The pieces are really, really easy to put together. Again, I love the fact that with Spellbinders dies, when you die cut them, if there's a piece that goes over top of it, there's a little indent showing you exactly where that piece gets placed. So there's very little guesswork to it. To me, it's fairly intuitive putting these pieces together. I used Bellini cardstock for her face and body, and then I used blush cardstock for her cheeks and lips. The hair and eyelashes and eyebrows are done with truffle cardstock. And then I did the accents on the robe with the wildberry cardstock. And I'm also going to be doing some florals right on top of her towel wrapped around her head to just kind of have accents and texture there. I think this is another area where using a wax seal would be fun on the towel as well as add a different texture and some different accents to it. I'm using that liquid glue to glue everything together, and because I chose the face that has all of those options in there, all of them they get indented right in there when you do that die cutting, so there's very little guesswork. You can easily see where all of those pieces are intended to go. Now, there's not a whole lot of difference between the Bellini cardstock and the blush. The blush is a little bit more pink. The Bellini is just a little bit more peach tone. So the lips and the cheeks are not really, really prominent. If you wanted, you could obviously choose a different color of cardstock to make them more prominent. I wanted it to be a little bit more of a natural look, so I opted for this. But I love the fact that you can pick and choose some of the different elements. For the next one, there's some cucumbers that go right over her eyes, and I think that is a fun addition for this as well. And like I said at the beginning of the video, the caboodle die set also coordinates with this. So if you wanted to her to have a little eye mask on her, that will fit on top of her as well. So that's another option to add to her as well. For the greenery for this one, I used some peridot cardstock as well as fern cardstock, so it would have a little bit of color variation from the rainforest cardstock that I used for her little towel wrap. And then I have flowers die cut out of the wildberry cardstock that's going to coordinate with the trim on her robe, as well as tutu cardstock. So while that is drying, I'm going to set that aside and I'm going to emboss the background. So I'm using some tutu cardstock here with the embossing folder of the month, using the stacking on my die cutting machine for doing 2D embossing folders, running that through. And once I have that run through, I'm going to trim that down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. I always prefer to trim down my embossed pieces after I have embossed them. The 2D folders are not as important as the 3D folders. Sometimes when you're embossing with 3D embossing folders, there's so much detail that it skews the measurements of the cardstock. So I find that by trimming them down afterwards, I know they're the exact size that I want them to be. I'm doing a little bit of ink blending around the outside edges of this with the Picked Raspberry Distress ink, and then I'm using that Lisa Horton gold ink pad and just rubbing over the surface so that we have some gold streaks on that raised surface. A little bit too heavy on that left side, but that's okay. So once I have that, I let that dry for a few moments and we're ready to assemble our card. So I'm going to put that onto my A2 card base, and then I'm going to glue my little figure on top of it. I'm lining her up with the bottom part of my embossed cardstock there so that it all fits within that embossed frame. And then I chose one of the sentiments from that clear stamp of the month, and I'm going to add that just right in front of her torso. You could also put that on the inside of the card as well. I chose to put this one on the front, and then I have a secondary sentiment that goes well with the first one, and I put that on the inside of the card. So the one on the front of the card says, "Have a self-love day on me." And then the one on the inside says, "Because you deserve more me time." So there's some fun sentiments in the clear stamp of the month, perfect for self-care and that sort of thing, as well as other ones. Like the one that I used on the owl card says, "You make life better." So there's a bunch of different choices with that, and I love that some of them kind of tie into each other, so you can use some of them for the front as well as some of them for the inside. For the second card with this, I'm choosing to use the Wildberry cardstock for her towel wrap. And then there's also a towel that kind of goes on the torso rather than the robe option. This is why I'm using the torso die set, because it just has some details on it that, or some pieces on it that are a little bit more detailed than just that silhouette back there. And I think it suits that little towel wrap a little bit better. So instead of using the silhouette behind these pieces and using twice as much cardstock, I just die cut her face and the torso and then glued the face onto the torso. For her hair, I'm using, as well as her eyebrows, I'm using fawn cardstock. I wanted to have a little bit of a different variation from the last one, so I chose fawn for this one. Again, you can pick and choose which colors you want for hair as well as eyebrows, and I think you can have a lot of fun with it. When it comes to the towel, I just glued those pieces on, and because there's layers on top of layers, there's little indents showing you exactly where those pieces glue together, making it really easy to add them to each other. For this particular one, because I'm going to put the cucumbers on top of her eyes, there are no eyelashes, there's no need for it. So I have those cucumber pieces assembled together. Those were done with fern cardstock as well as peridot cardstock, and those could just go right over top of the areas for her eyes. I love that little fun option. I think it's a really great one for, say, a self-care card or for a spa day card. And I just love that there's so many different options in the set. Now, once her face and torso are done, we can start adding the florals to the towel. So I chose the Wildberry cardstock for the center flower, and then I'm using tutu cardstock for the ones around the outside so that it shows up on the towel. I also use the same colors as the last card for my greenery. I tried to change up the arrangement just a little bit. So I have some of the larger leaves die cut out of the peridot cardstock, and then some of the smaller ones die cut out of the fern cardstock. And I put the smaller leaves on top of the larger ones. I want to make sure that they can all be seen and visible, but it does add a lot of texture to that towel as well. Before gluing those on, I just placed on my third wax seal. That's another option if you wanted to add that. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the wax seal from this month. I think an option from one of the previous months would also be fun. And there's even, Spellbinders has mini wax seals. Those ones would be fun for on the towel as well. Just an easy way to add just a little bit of extra texture. So here you can see the differences between the two. They're very subtle. They're not like extreme differences, but I love the fact that there are different ways that you can assemble them. For the background for this card, I opted to use my solid hot foiled gold background. I trimmed that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And then I used a piece of the, I think this is rainforest cardstock for my mat. I trimmed that down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. I'm going to glue that onto my A2 card base. A green just ties in the greens within the image as well. And I think Wildberry would look great as well. Or you could leave a mat out of there. I always love adding mats because they frame things in and I think they just finish it off. But there's sometimes when you don't necessarily need them. Once I have those mats on my card base, I can add my little figure there and then add one of the sentiments. So this one I chose wrapped in care and tied with love. I thought that was a fun sentiment for this particular card. Originally I put it off to the right, but it just looked a little bit odd because the flowers or the florals on the towel were a little bit off to the right. So I thought it looked a little bit lopsided. So I ended up moving it and putting it right on the front of her torso. But again, you could add that sentiment to the inside of the card if you didn't want to put it on the front of her. For my next card, actually the next 2 cards, I'm going to be using the stitching die of the month. For this particular one, I am going to stitch on it, and then I'm going to show you an option with a different design that doesn't have any stitching. So I love the fact that you can stitch on this, or you can have an option without doing stitching on it. For the heart here, I have that die cut out of Wildberry cardstock, and I'm going to stitch with the gold floss just to tie in the different gold accents. I think this would look great with just regular floss as well. By stitching on these pieces, it just adds a little bit of extra texture to your cards. I don't do this on every single card, but it's always fun to have that option. It's something that's a little bit unexpected and a little bit different. Now, I like to start my floss off when I'm stitching by tying or by taping it down using a tiny little piece of Best Ever Craft tape. That way I don't need to worry about my floss getting loose and coming through. For this particular one, because metallic thread is a little bit stiffer than the regular floss, I do tend to use my pinky finger and ring finger to kind of hold that floss taut while I'm doing that stitching. You don't necessarily need to do this, and I definitely don't do this every time, and I don't typically do this when I'm using regular floss, but I just found that because this piece was a little bit smaller and that floss is a little bit stiffer and thicker, that it is just, to me, it's helpful. Once I'm done doing that stitching, I tape that floss off on the back, and then I also have a silhouette of this heart die cut, and I'm going to glue those two pieces together. And I hold them together with some sewing clips while they're drying. That way my hands are free to be doing my stitching on my second piece here. To die cut these hearts, there is that silhouette, that outside edge. There's also the inside stitching piece, and that's why for this card and the next card, there's an option to do that stitching or to not do that stitching. So it gives you more options. If it's a set that has stitching dies that doesn't have that silhouette to it, I just cut that stitching die a second time, and that's what I glue to the back of it. I like having that on the back there because I find it makes putting my cards together a lot easier because I have that cardstock piece back there to glue those pieces down. It also adds some extra dimension. Now, when I am doing this stitching, there are little indents that get placed in that die cut when you're die cutting, so it shows you exactly where they intend for those stitching lines to go. So I'm not reinventing anything or inventing anything here. I'm just following those stitching lines, and it's kind of a starburst from the center. I go up through the center, down through the next hole. They're very easy to use, and they're not complicated in any way. It doesn't really matter what the backside looks like because none of that is going to be seen. So I don't need to make the backside look pretty in any way, shape, or form. Once I'm done that second piece, I'm going to do the same thing as the first piece. I'm going to use a tiny little piece of Best Ever Craft tape. I'm going to tape the end of that floss in place, cut the excess off, and then I'm going to glue it to my silhouette backing. And then I'll put the sewing clips on that and let that completely dry. This is just a personal preference thing. It's not a thing that you need to do, but again, I prefer it because it makes assembling the card easier. That floss not only adds dimension to the front of that stitch piece, but it also adds dimension to the back. So it's not going to glue down really flat. So by putting that floss in between those two pieces of cardstock, it seals everything in. I know that I'm not going to have my pieces falling apart. I'm not going to have floss coming out, and it just makes it easier to assemble my card once I'm done. So for this card here, I have pieces die cut out of Rainforest cardstock as well as Fawn cardstock for one of the mugs. And then I have Tutu and Wildberry for the other mug. My coffee for in the mugs, as well as the little steam lines that I'm going to be adding, and my sentiment were die cut out of Truffle cardstock. I also die cut a silhouette out of the Wildberry cardstock for my sentiment and just tucked it to or glued it to the back, but just adjusted it so that it has a little bit of that Wildberry shadow to it, so you see that color. Now, this set has two different sentiments that will fit into that banner die. One says a perfect blend, and that's what I'm using on this card. The second one says let's chat soon, and then there's a script die that says love you. So there's a few different options that you can use for creating cards with this particular set. For the background for my first card, I'm using that 3D embossing folder of the month. I'm using Fawn cardstock to emboss that. And once I have that embossed, I'm trimming down some Wildberry cardstock to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches for my mat. And I'm going to trim down that embossed cardstock down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. To add just a little bit of visual dimension, I'm just doing a little bit of ink blending around the outside edges to frame it. I always love having it darker around the edges and lighter towards the center. I just think it frames it. It just adds some interest as well. Once that background is done, we're ready to start assembling our cards. So we're going to glue down the Wildberry mat first. And again, this is an A2 card base. I typically do white card bases for all of my cards because white cardstock tends to be fairly economical. And I just tend to use the colored cardstock for the pieces on the front. I typically love that white frame around the outside. And yeah, I'd like to use my cardstock or my colored cardstock for my backgrounds and for my die cuts. So when it comes to assembling the card here, now I add the heart. And this is about when I realized that I assembled my mugs, or actually I die cut them a little bit wrong. When you die cut the inside part of the mugs, there is an area that is tilted for the coffee or the tea that gets put inside. I have mine so that they tilt towards each other, but if you look at the package directions, they're supposed to tilt the other way. It would make sense, or it doesn't make sense for the coffee to be towards the outside if those mugs are tilted towards each other. So I changed the way that I planned on having my little design here, but it gives me an opportunity to share two different ways to use these mugs. So for this particular one, the coffee is tilted towards the inside. That's the way that makes sense with the mug. I have them so that the heart isn't necessarily fitted together, but I'll have them fitted together for the next set. I have them a little bit raised. I chose to put my sentiment, the perfect blend or a perfect blend, on the bottom of this card and put my mugs above it, and then put those little steam marks above that. For the next one here, this one, I'm going to take a little bit of extra care and make sure that I have them tilted towards the right way when I'm doing my assembly. It's a little bit easier with this one because I have the cups as well as the inside pieces die cut out of the same colors. That's why I said with the last one, it was actually my die cutting that I had done wrong. I hadn't really thought that part through. I had assumed which way the mugs were supposed to be tilted. And, you shouldn't assume everything. So once I have them set out to make sure that I'm going to assemble them properly, I start to assemble those pieces. For this one, I used some blush cardstock for the mugs. The inside part is die cut out of 2x2 cardstock, and then the hearts on the front were die cut out of that wild berry cardstock, only using that silhouette die for the outside piece and not the stitching die for the inside piece. I wanted to show how it looked with the stitching as well as without the stitching, so you can see the two different looks to it. For this one, because there's an option for little tea bags, I chose to use that for this card. But the thing is I should have added that to the mug outside die cuts before adding that inside piece to the top. No problem. Crafters are really good at creative problem solving. So the solution to this was just using some detail scissors and trimming off that top part of that little string from the tea bag. For the second mug, I trimmed that off before time. Otherwise, there's a little bit too much sticking up out of the mug if you don't trim that off. It's a really, really easy fix. For the tea bag, I did the base part out of that wild berry cardstock. The top part gets die cut with a heart out of it. So I wanted that heart to be that pink color. The rest of it is die cut out of some truffle cardstock. I chose truffle cardstock for this because I didn't want to introduce yet another card or another color. You obviously, if you're doing tea, could choose a different color. I also tend to like to steep my tea for a really, 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 really long time. I don't like a lot of tea, but there's a cinnamon tea that I drink that I absolutely love, and I tend to brew it for about 10-15 minutes, which is way too long in most teas, but I like it because I like the strong flavor of that one. So I was good with having a darker color for my tea because of that. For the background for this card, I'm using that gold foiled Glimmer of the Month. And then for this sentiment, for the banner, I chose Let's Chat Soon. I opted to not offset my shadow to this, so it's die cut right underneath that. And then I also am using that Love You die cut from this set. So it says, Let's Chat Soon, Love You. And then I have those pink mugs that are going to go towards the bottom. There's two different options for steam. I chose one of them for that first card. For this second card, because I thought it just worked a lot better with the color scheme for this particular card, I chose the little steam that goes in a heart shape. So it's fun, again, to have many different options to be able to customize your cards to go exactly how you would like them to go. So when I'm placing these mugs, they are tilted to the other side, the different way than my last card. And you can see that my tea in them is shifted the right way in the mugs than they were on the last one. And to be honest, if you look at the first card and the second card, I don't think one of them looks right or one of them looks wrong. It just really depends whether you want those hearts to line up with the center of the cups. And again, I think they both look fine. I really love the fact that you can, change them a little bit to change up the looks to them. For my last card here, I'm going to be using that caboodle. I'm using the little slippers from it. There is that eye mask, and this also coordinates with that large die of the month. I opted to only use the slippers for this particular one. I have them die cut out of fawn cardstock, and then the base of the slippers die cut out of truffle cardstock. I did just a little bit of light ink blending with that brush corduroy distress ink just to give them a little bit of texture to them. Now, I opted to do them out of just plain cardstock. I often love doing things that are supposed to be fuzzy out of velvet cardstock. Sometimes I think I might do it too much, so I opted not to do that with this one, but if you have velvet cardstock, this would be a great place to use it. I think it would also be great to use it for the towels on top of the girl's head for those self-care cards. I think those ones would be a fun way to use the velvet cardstock as well. For those ones, I didn't have the right colors, as well as the fact that I didn't think about it until I was completely done. But I just wanted to share that option, a fun way to add some extra texture. Once I have that ink blending done, I'm going to assemble those die cuts. I used wildberry cardstock for the base part underneath the face of the slippers as well as the ears, so we have a nice pop of pink there. Again, they're assembled with that Barely Art glue. It just gives you that bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. I use it for pretty much everything. Once I have those slippers together, I'm going to let that dry for just a few moments. And then while that's drying, I can trim down the pieces for my background. So for my background for this card, I'm going to be using the Glimmer of the Month foiled background that's done with the bright pink on the Cosmic Sky cardstock. And then I'm going to be using that solid hot foiled piece as well. It's just going to add a nice touch of metallic. Another option here would be to use either one of the embossing folders of the month. I think those would be great as well. But I still had these pieces left over, and they also tie in with the pinks on the slippers, on the ears and the nose. So that all ties everything in nicely. So that solid hot foiled piece was trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My foiled piece on the Cosmic Sky cardstock is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and those are both layered onto an A2 card base. And now we're ready to add our die cuts. Now I'm going to put them layered on the center of the card, and I have a sentiment that I'm going to put towards the top and one towards the bottom. You could easily take one of these sentiments and put that on the inside, preferably the bottom one. To me, that makes the most sense. For the top one, I have Just Because You're You, and then the bottom one, I have Unwind and Refresh on Me. That one I think could easily go and be put on the inside of the card if you wanted to. Sometimes I do it on the front, sometimes I do it on the back or on the inside. It just depends on the space on the front. This time there was enough space to have that extra one there. But again, you can pick and choose whether you want them there or whether you want it on the inside. Then we have our Love You card with the cups tilted the way the die intended so that the hearts match on the inside, as well as our stitched cups that are tilted the opposite way, but I still think they look fantastic. And I love that gold stitching detail. It just adds that perfect metallic touch to the card. Then our self-care card, this one with the cucumbers. And obviously you can use those cucumbers with other cards as well. I think they would be great for spring cards. These ones would be fun, I think, to add to the brunch one from last month. I think you could add the cucumbers to that as well. Then we have our first self-care card with the greens. Then we have our adorable owls with that foiled heart in the background. Those are absolutely adorable. Again, perfect for Valentine's Day, but I think they would be fun as a wedding card. I think you could easily turn the female into a bride and the male into a groom, which would be a fun twist, especially for an owl lover. Then our adorable I'd Pick You Otter card, as well as that beautiful lock background with that 3D embossing folder of the month. I love those gold touches on those locks, and the fact that there's the contrast between the embossing and that background. It just is such a striking but very simple card. Then our adorable Stencil of the Month background. Such a simple way to create a scene and a very simple card, but you could go with all sorts of different color combinations with this one as well. Then our very first card with that heart foiled background and that lime green that really lets those pinks show up. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.